Hi everyone, and thank you for tuning in to my talk. I want to tell you a bit about my recent work that I've done together with Baptiste Verly, Marta Manser and Ariana Strandburg-Peshkin on the different communicational modes in meerkat vocal signals. So communication is considered to be an interactive process. There are signalers and receivers and an exchange of information between those two parties. There is an active debate regarding the drivers of signaling. It could be a reflection of internal state, an attempt to manipulate receivers' behavior, and in case of humans, an intention to inform. But for animals, I don't think that this was ever clearly shown. But anyway, it is clear that the signalers can influence the behavior of receivers. Now let's go back to the level of information. What can we say about its flow between the participants? Regardless of any intent to inform, how the relative informational states of both signalers and receivers changes during the signaling event. If we take, for example, an isolated case of individual A producing a call, the receiver, B, is the one being informed. It acquires information that was not available before. After receiving and processing this information, it responds. Now, there is some processing lag before behavioral response is activated. This lag can vary according to complexity of the information or completeness of the information. But overall, we accept that some new information was added to B, stimulating change of its behavior. So the receiver side is more or less clear. But what is the signaler A is doing? Is it informing? Is it directional to B? Does it mean that A necessarily has access to more information? Is it just an automated response to some stimuli or to its own internal state? Another interesting question is, are there expectations to the outcome of this signaling event? I personally think they are expectations. Let's say an animal emits an aggression call during a food competition event and an opponent backs off. After a few repetitions, this individual will learn that this is a desirable outcome. Same for a pup who lost its mom or someone who got separated from a group. It emits a distress call, an objective reflection of its own stress level, and in many cases the mother or other group members will call back. At what point this individual will realize, if I want to hear and find my mates, I need to call them first. At what point a signal will appear that will reflect an individual need for information. Similar to the way animals initiate signaling and transmit aggression, arousal, mating intentions, they might transmit their state of informational hunger by signaling. And let's stay in that context of finding where my group mates are. Under Robert Burns' reunite hypothesis, animals either learn or possess hardwired knowledge that maintaining vocal contact prevents isolation. This stimulates reciprocal exchange of contact calls. Animals get an updated information on the whereabouts and the identities of their neighbors. Doing this vocally, in contrast to visually scanning the environment, is just more efficient. It interferes less with foraging, for example. It does not require exposing myself by finding higher ground, and it is much more dynamic than olfactory signaling. Under this framework, the initiation of signaling would be driven by an uninformed state of an individual. It would be sort of a request for information on the positions and identities of its neighbors. If a response is given, the interaction is complete. If a response is not given and the state of informational hunger is not resolved, the same individual would be more likely to repeat its call in an attempt to further motivate its neighbors for responding. To detect this type of signaling dynamics in natural settings, we need to start with recording all animals in the group to get the vocal events over a continuous period of time. The recorded calls must be reliably assigned to identified callers, and they also need to be accurately synchronized so the order of calls from different individuals will be preserved. We need a reasonably accurate position of each animal to make sure that they are located at a relevant distance for a call exchange. To collect this dataset, we have combined TechnoSmart Gypsy 5 GPS logger with TS Market EDIC Mini audio recorder into a miniature audio GPS tag. The collars were deployed on meerkats at the Kalahari Research Center in South Africa. Meerkats are a social mongoose species with complex social and communication system. Their vocal repertoires have been well described, and the habituated population at the KRC allows easy deployment and retrieval of those tags. Meerkats forage as a group and frequently emit contact calls that have been previously shown to have a role in maintaining group cohesion. For this analysis, we tagged 13 adult individuals from an organic meerkat group. The animals were recorded for 8 consecutive days, and we used 1 hour of audio per each collection day. In each audio file, the calls were manually marked and labeled, overall reaching 12,000 calls from 8 different call types. So the data structure per each daily set consisted of a sequence of calls emitted by the group. Each call had a precise timestamp, GPS position, and ID of the caller. Out of the whole meerkat vocal repertoire, we considered 8 most frequent call types. Close calls, being used for maintaining group cohesion and contact. Short note calls, serving as an appeasing signal and also emitted at sentinel context. Social calls, those are begging and also generally undefined social interaction calls. Alarm and aggression, which are more or less self-explanatory. Move and lead calls related to movement initiation, and unknown calls that could not be assigned to any of the above-mentioned categories. As a first step, we examined the transitions between different call types in order to understand better how meerkat vocal interactions look like. When considering call transitions, we used 2 cutoff values. For a call to be assigned as a trigger initiation of the signaling event, it had to be emitted after at least 10 seconds of total group silence. For a call to be considered a response to that initiation trigger event, it had to be given within 5 seconds after an initiation call and by an individual positioned within 20 meters from the initiator. This way we were certain that we are not looking at impossible interactions of distant individuals, and also that the response call is most likely stimulated by the initiation trigger. This is a transition matrix between different call types. Y-axis is the initiation and X-axis is the response. The values are the transition probabilities subtracted from random probabilities, which were generated by permuting the data. So light color cells are about equal to random, red cells are above, and blue cells are below. Looking at call and reply pairs, we see that there is a general tendency of responding to a trigger call with the same call type. This is visible on both self-replies, when an individual follows on call, and also for caller exchange events, when the trigger and response calls are given by different individuals. And while there are also some interesting cross-call type transitions, for the scope of this work we have decided to focus only on the same call type pairs. As a next step, we compare different call types for the proportion of self-replies and non-self-replies. So green area is the self-reply and red area is the non-self-reply or caller exchange. There is one call type that is clearly different from others, and this is the cohesion-related close call. While alarm, aggression, and sentinel calls are mostly repeated by the same caller, cohesion calls are in the majority of cases replied by neighbors, and self-reply events are much less common. This hints us as close calls could be produced as a part of vocal interaction, while other calls could be more general broadcast signals, or at least less coupled with vocal responses of conspecifics. If close calls are indeed given in interactive context, we theoretically might see distance effect. Receivers might need additional time to process signals arriving from further away, or time for collecting additional information. We have filtered the data for calls that were replied by a conspecific neighbor and looked at the response time against the distance between the caller and the receiver. Here I'm showing only 4 call types that had comparable sample sizes, X-axis is the distance and Y-axis is the response time. Close call exchanges show distance-dependent response time pattern. Near individuals get quicker replies and further individuals get slower replies. Similar pattern, but with lower time lag, is visible for short note calls. Social calls and aggression calls do not demonstrate any distance-dependent response pattern. Also, aggression calls are only given at relatively short distances, and this is typical as those calls are generally emitted during immediate close proximity aggression physical interactions. So at least for close calls, it seems that we fulfilled the prerequisites for the reunite hypothesis. But more interesting question lies here with the initiator's motivation. Is close call initiation constitutes a request for information? Is there an expectation of getting a reply? Are close calls an attempt to stimulate conspecifics of revealing their position and decreasing the initiator's state of informational hunger? In order to support that, we would need to show that if a reply is not received and the informational hunger is not reduced, there would be a higher probability to repeat the signal again and again and again until one of the conspecifics responds. So we're still fine-tuning this analysis, but from a very coarse look at the data, it seems that it might be the case. If a reply is given following a trigger call, there is a decreased probability for additional call in comparison to cases in which there were no conspecific responses, and then there is an elevated chance of the same individual repeating the close call again. To summarize, calls could be defined by the communication modes. Close call function is dependent on interactive call exchange with conspecifics, while other call types could be general broadcast, not necessarily aimed at stimulating a vocal response from neighbors. Initiation of close call interaction could be an information-seeking behavior by an individual motivated to gather information on the positions and identities of its neighbors. Both signaling modes are essentially a goal-directed behavior, but their expected outcomes lie in a very different domains. With broadcast signaling of alarm or aggression, an individual maybe tries to stimulate an action or transmits its own internal state, which can be resolved by the action of receivers. With contact calls, the expected reaction is a vocal one. The receiver is solicited to call back, revealing its location to the signaler. We are still talking about first-order intentionality here, as it is driven by the own state of each one of the callers. But in a group, it generates a reciprocal signaling dynamics. The resulting interaction pattern resembles a Marco Polo game, when participants ping their friends for information of their whereabouts. So that's all I have to say on this for now. Thank you very much for listening. I would also like to thank all the field assistants and research assistants who helped collecting the data and labeling the audio files, the funding agencies who supported and still keep supporting this project, and if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.